All right. So hello and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Safety Chain Software and Food Safety Tech. My name is Patty Murray with Food Safety Tech, and we're excited to be hosting this webinar on FSMA Preventive Controls, Identifying Gaps in Your Food Safety Programs. During this special roundtable discussion, we encourage you to send in your questions at any time using the Q&A feature, which you can find on the WebEx menu to the right under Options. Also, please open up your chat feature to receive periodic messages from me throughout the event. So we have a lot of very valuable information coming your way today, and we're going to get right to it. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for today's webinar, Jill Bender, Vice President of Marketing for Safety Chain Software. Jill?
Thank you, Patty, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're very excited about this session today. It's been an overwhelming response, obviously, with the first compliance date fast approaching here, but just in general, I think lots of questions still on defining your food safety plans to meet the FSMA preventive controls. I'm absolutely delighted to have both Stephanie Faucetta and Cathy Crawford with HACCP Consulting Group to bring a little bit more insights on how best to define what gaps there are and questions and so forth regarding preventive controls of FSMA. Cathy, just a brief background. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the HACCP Consulting Group. Both Cathy Crawford and Stephanie Faucetta are out there working with many organizations, but just a little bit of a background. Cathy joined HACCP Consulting Group in 2008, has over 20 years of experience in consulting, food manufacturing, food chemistry, and microbiology laboratories, registered trainer and former auditor for FSQA, and holds a certificate in international food law from Michigan State University, an MS food safety degree, and also, of course, a bachelor's in science. Stephanie Faucetta has been working with HACCP Consulting Group since 2012, brings a wealth of experience, over 12 years of quality assurance in consumer packaged food production, refrigerated dough products, cereal, confectionery, cheese processing, and so forth. Stephanie is a qualified advanced SQF practitioner, lead instructor for FSPCA Preventive Controls for Human Food course, and a HACCP trainer, and she obtained her BS in Chemical Engineering from Louisa State University. So welcome, both Cathy and Stephanie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill.
Excellent. Well, we're going to go ahead and just sort of dive in. Lots of topics and discussions here, and we're excited to share some of your insights. So, Stephanie, why don't you get us started here? What are the hazards that haven't been on the radar in the past that should now be considered?
Well, Jill, there's been a couple things that have been brought up with this new FSMA legislation that weren't on the radar before. One of them is allergen control. That's never been formally addressed by the FDA. And it's really in response to undeclared allergens being the #1 cause of recalls. We have so many companies who struggle with proper labeling on their products, and we've had a lot of issues where undeclared allergens cause sicknesses and death out in the market, that this has become something that the FDA considers for you to have in control in your facility. Another new hazard that wasn't on the radar before is really sanitation control. So if you say you're going to manage potential hazards by cleaning equipment and surfaces, especially when you're talking about ready-to-eat products, you're saying I'm going to clean this to manage any micro or biological issues here, then you need to have a well-defined sanitation program, one that you can prove is effective, is working, you've trained your employees on how to use it, and you're documenting when and how you're cleaning your equipment. Another new hazard on the radar is radiological hazards. This is one that's really strange to most folks, and it's kind of unique to plants that are near a nuclear site or maybe built on an old dump site. It really came to be after the tsunami and some of these nuclear plant issues we've had over the past few years. Another is economic fraud, and this is really focused on things that could impact food safety. So an example of this would be in spices or other types of powdered ingredients, like maybe ground peanuts and cumin. where the undeclared allergen in that spice is really the hazard. So this economic fraud when it affects food safety. And then the last new hazard that is being addressed by this legislation is supply chain hazards. So is food safety being maintained throughout the supply chain? And when you're thinking about that and you're looking at foods that have a risk or a hazard, are they being managed upstream of your facility? Are you managing them in-house by, let's say, pasteurization or chemically treating or cooking a product? Or are you expecting your customer to manage those hazards for you? And really defining, how am I going to control this hazard? Is it being controlled before it's sent to me? Am I controlling it in my facility? Or will it be controlled downstream of my facility? So these are some really specific things that were never really on the radar before, and now as food production facilities, we have to learn how to manage these and have really good record keeping and documentation on how we are managing these in our facilities.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. You know, what's interesting, too, is we hear a lot about allergen controls, economic fraud. I think those are really issues that come out in the press quite a bit, certainly for the general audience. So I think these other key components are great to at least point out as well. Just really quickly, I've got a couple of chats asking if the recording is going to be sent out. It will be, as well as these slides. So I know a lot of us take notes fast and fiercely, but you will be getting a recording to this as well. Thanks, Stephanie. Anything more to add, or should we move on to the next question?
You can move on to the next question.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Cathy, I'm going to go ahead and move this over to you. You know, we were talking about gaps, and obviously with both yours and Stephanie's experience out there and working with customers, what do you see as typically the biggest gaps from current plans to FSMA requirements? Oops, I think you might be on mute there. Cathy, let me see.
Sure, no, I'm here.
Oh,
happy to address that. One of the biggest gaps we see starts with companies that don't have a HACCP plan prepared. Quite simply, HACCP really fosters safety and quality, and all that time and effort that goes into a well-designed HACCP plan usually leads to identification of concerns or improvements that weren't considered previously, and leads to a stronger system and better regulatory compliance. It truly improves the process and helps you show that things are being done correctly. A lot of companies we work with basically know how to do the right thing, and they know the basics, and they're very proud of what they do. But doing the right thing with pride and not having proof of it isn't going to work. It's not sustainable. So developing that proof, typically by starting with a HACCP plan, is becoming mandatory for not just food manufacturers, but related industries like pet food and packaging companies. So companies that don't have a HACCP plan should consider starting there. But the next step is that those who do have HACCP don't have a food safety plan, because under the new regulation, a food safety plan is bigger. A food safety plan encourages a more broad view to include things in the hazard analysis that might not have been considered before, things Stephanie mentioned earlier, but also things like employee hygiene or the environment or sometimes even the weather. A food safety plan is bigger. It starts with the hazard analysis. It includes that supply chain program, allergen controls, sanitation controls, maybe other controls, and a recall plan as well. So you can see the system needs to grow to ensure compliance. The other thing that we see that is very common is just a lack of discipline on documentation. Good record keeping is so essential. And in the past, we're probably all familiar with that phrase, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. Now what I teach people is that we have to elevate that. And the new concept in my mind is the way you wrote it down is the way it happened. And so that encourages you to think about how much detail needs to be documented. Don't forget units of measure. Don't forget being able to draw the connection between the data you collected and the tool you used and the records it created. It's essential to have all those things. It's also increasing in the record keeping that's required, because now we need training records to show that you have a record of employee training for who completed the food safety related activities. The food industry, I often say, is kind of opposite of the American way. And part of the American way is that you're innocent until proven guilty when there's an issue. In the food industry, it's the other way around. You're guilty unless you can prove you're innocent. And so with the new regulatory requirements, this further enhances the need for good records. The next bullet point up there is talking about the hazard analysis and how it doesn't address things beyond the flow chart. What I call traditional HACCP looks at your process flow and step-by-step how you make a finished product or provide a service. And each step is analyzed in the hazard analysis. If you look at the definition of a hazard analysis under FSMA, it doesn't say step by step. It just says it's an analysis. And it needs to include those steps, but it also needs to include support functions, like how purchasing is conducted, especially with supplier selection, how R&D is conducted to see how they select new ingredients. And the hazard analysis should even go so far as to look at building design and how that might impact cross-contact of allergens or cross-contamination. You should also consider sanitation, which is definitely not a typical step in the flow chart, but it needs to be part of the hazard analysis and often needs to be handled as a preventive control. And then the last bullet that we find is typically a gap is that verification is incomplete. Verification and validation are probably the most misunderstood concepts in the industry. It's not easy. I teach an entire one-day course on the topic, helping people understand the differences and identify how to do it better. But very briefly, all your food safety activities have to be completed and effective. And there needs to be documentation to support both those concepts, that you did it and that it will work and that it is working, not just today, but daily. And then retain those records of verification and validation according to the applicable retention policies. So all of these areas are where we're seeing gaps. Most people have food safety systems in place, but the level of detail and the attention to more specific topics within the hazard analysis drawn out from FSMA and a more broad hazard analysis are the key things that we see missing. That hazard analysis really is the key, and everything flows from there.
Great. Thank you, Cathy. It was interesting. I was curious to see where we're going with that American way comment. I haven't heard that before, but it gave a really good, put everything in good context there. Appreciate that comment. Well, let's go ahead and move on. And Stephanie, I'm going to go ahead and bring you back in here. You know, again, based on the new rules, so where should we begin?
Cathy really hit the nail on the head on the hazard analysis. It's really important that you're thinking about your whole system. And the way I like to tell folks to begin is to start with your ingredients. Go through each of your ingredients and think about what are the hazards associated with this ingredient. And then you go into your process hazard analysis and you're asking yourself, what new hazards am I introducing to this ingredient? Even if you already have one, it's really important to go back and review it. And don't be limited by the boxes in your process flow chart. Really, if you're used to just focusing on biological, chemical, and physical hazards, now it's time to think about supply chain, allergen, and sanitation as well. So this can be a little intimidating for most folks because there's so many things, so many different hazards out there. So what I'll give you in the next few slides is some examples on how to determine when an item should be controlled by a prerequisite program, when it should be considered to be a CCP, or even when it's something that can be a preventive control. So the formats can really vary on how you do a hazard analysis. There's no requirement that it has to look a certain way, it's just that it must be done. Even if you decide that you have no critical control points in your plant, you still need to have written proof that you did a hazard analysis for your system. So, Jill, if you could go to the next slide, I'll show one example of a decision tree. This is, great, like I said, just an example. It helps you to decide if there are potential hazards in your system require a PC or can be managed by a prerequisite program. And a PC is a preventive control. This is a term that was introduced in this legislation. It's all throughout. And items that require a preventive control, that require a PC, need to be truly addressing the hazard, and they need to be well documented, and in some cases they need to be verified. So this decision tree just gives you a place to start. It asks a series of questions so you can determine how you're going to manage this. So you can see the first one, based on the likelihood of occurrence and severity of adverse health effects, is the hazard significant? If you answer no, then it's managed by a prerequisite program. We're used to seeing PRP, but in the case of this slide, PP stands for prerequisite program. If the answer is yes, it kind of goes through. Is it managed at this step, or is it managed later on in the process? Then as you keep going through and you're answering your questions here, the one that's, is it necessary to establish the critical limits for the control measure at this step? If you answer no, then it's an operational prerequisite program. If you keep going through there and you say, yes, I'm going to manage it at this place, and this is such a serious point in my process that if I lost control, I would most likely cause harm to a consumer, then that would be something that you'd manage through a CCP. So this is an example of a way to start this process of trying to decide what should be elevated to the level of a CCP, or even something that's controlled by a preventive control measure.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Should I go ahead and forward to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay. I think here then how, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to frame it, you know, again, how best to assess the hazards based on the new rules.
So this is another example of a typical risk assessment matrix. You've all probably seen something similar to this. You can use this in your own facilities if you want a really concrete way to quote-unquote grade different risk in your process. You can change the wording if it doesn't make sense for your facility, but the numbers need to stay the same. So this one in particular, as we go through it, is for physical hazards. So first off, I'll explain to you how you come up with we're going to calculate the risk level and the level of control we need here. So on the left-hand side of the table, it says control. This is the level of control. So something that's a quality risk, you'd manage through a prerequisite program. Something that's a safety risk, you could measure through an operational prerequisite program. Critical risk, critical control point, and then significant critical control point says you should consider managing with multiple CCP points. So Jill, if you don't mind us going to the next slide, you see down at the bottom left is the risk level calculation. So we're going to look at each of these, and again, this is an example for physical. We're going to calculate what a severity rating is. We're going to multiply that by a size rating, and then we're going to multiply it by likelihood or probability of occurrence. I really personally like this chart because it gives really concrete numbers and data of how to assess what's a minor, medium, or major and different sizes. So on this one, it shows the severity rating guidance. There's minor, medium, and major. You can see the different physical hazards there. So if you've identified that you have a physical hazard at one point in your process, I'll show you an example as we get through these. You assign a number to that. So that would be the first number of your equation, either a 1, 2, or 3. And Jill, please advance. The next number that you're going to put into your equation is the size. So this one gives 4 choices for size, and it's all around this choke hazard guidelines from the FDA. Now, this is just an example. These numbers could vary if you're marketing a product directly towards children. You may have your own internal standards of what you consider not a safety hazard, a minor, a major, or a choke hazard. So please use this as guidance and look at your own products and systems to make sure this is valid. So if you think you have a risk of something going into your product that's less than 7 millimeters, you'd assign a 2 to the risk level part of this equation. And then the last number, as we go to the next slide, is the likelihood. So what is the probability that this could actually happen in my product? Is it likely to occur? How do you even figure that out? Well, you'd look at your complaint data, and if you can see trends there. I'm getting a complaint about this once a month, or maybe I only got a complaint about this once in the last 3 years. That's how you determine what the likelihood is of occurrence here. And if you don't have complaint data, let's say this is a brand new product, then use industry data or make a informed, educated choice on what you think the likelihood is there. Now we'll tie it all together. On this next slide, you'll see all 3 of those categories at the bottom in the equation. So let's say to give an example, we are in a plant and we have whole almonds. We use this rubber finger kind of machine to separate the whole almonds as they're dumped because we have them coated in some kind of sugar and they get clumped up. We know there's a remote risk of rubber falling apart on those fingers. It's old equipment and we just haven't had the money to update it. So typically we've seen rubber pieces fall off that are between 4 and 6 millimeters. We've never had any that are over 7 millimeters. So we know this is a hazard in our system. We've identified it in our hazard analysis, and now we're going to decide how we're going to manage it. So first off, we look at the severity. It's soft plastic. So you can see in the category, soft plastic is a level 2. So that's the first number of our equation. So we have a 2 severity. Then we look at size. We know we're between 4 and 6 millimeters. So that means we're under that 7 millimeter mark. So it's a minor hazard. So the second number in our equation is another 2. And the probability is the last number. We had 2 consumer complaints in the last 6 months about this plastic. So that pushes us up to a 3. There's a potential, this is a potential probability that this could occur. So now we have our 3 numbers, 2 times 2 times 3. We're at a 12 on our chart, right? So when we look up at the chart, the 12 is considered a safety risk. And I'd manage that through an operational prerequisite program there. So that's how you use the chart, and that gives you an idea, again, an example of a way to put a really concrete number to the likelihood of a hazard occurring in your process. You can change this around. You can change the things at the bottom for a chemical hazard or a biological hazard. So you can really use this as a guidance to give yourself a grade on a hazard.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And I assume this is sort of a process that you all go through quite a bit with your customers, right?
Definitely, definitely. This is something that people like to see because they want to be able to give a concrete number to a hazard, because it's really easy to say, oh, it might happen and you want to list it on there, but this gives you a way to grade it if it needs to be controlled in a different way than some of the things that can be controlled through a prerequisite program.
And then the assumption is that this documentation of the process and what you've gone through is again, part of showing the food safety plan. Is that right?
Yes. It gives you some kind of concrete data behind your hazard analysis to show where you came up with these decisions.
Okay, great. Thank you. And again, these slides will be sent out. Quite a bit was covered here, but I think really helpful on an overall basis here. So let me go ahead and move forward then. Cathy, I'll ask you to help us out here. When you talk about sort of the common barriers in implementing programs, or more importantly, once you've implemented, maintaining, what do you find out there?
Well, you can see the number one thing is record-keeping issues. That's of primary concern, and I know I mentioned it earlier, but I really can't emphasize it enough. Records need to be created at the time of the event, and they need to be retained at least 2 years. So that includes measurements like time and temperature or concentration, but keep in mind it also might include portions of your food safety plan, the supporting material that you used to make decisions, like those charts Stephanie was showing, or even the hazard analysis itself. And also keep in mind there are new requirements to maintain training records as well. For almost all employees, they're going to be called qualified individuals if they are employees who are actively involved in activities that might be associated with food safety. So other records that have to be kept would be any kind of monitoring records for a critical control point, a process preventive control or a preventive control, verification records, and training records, as I mentioned. And for the most part, the retention time is 2 years. I did want to bring up one thing that complicates record retention just a little bit, and that's for people in the transportation industry. As the sanitary transportation regulation comes along in March, there's a requirement for training for certain carriers if they handle food. That training is supposed to be retained at least 12 months beyond the time when that person last conducted activity associated with the training. So if John Doe works for you for 10 years and he quits, then you need to keep his training records at least 1 additional year beyond that. So don't just assume that all record keeping is 2 years. Sometimes it might be longer. So, and while I was getting ready for this webinar today, my email popped up, and of course it distracted me just like it does everybody else. And there was an ad for a seminar for small business owners, and of course that's of concern to me. But it was all about how to make sure your data is secure. So that's something people need to keep in mind as well. Are your records secure? Do you have backup copies? And do you have protection against some sort of hacker or error or system issue? That's an important thing that we might not be thinking about enough. Verification, I mentioned earlier, is always a challenge. Some examples of what we can do that are good for verification are typically calibration, record review, and direct observation. Those are effective tools. All 3 are not always required, but they're advised. If you think about taking temperatures, you would want to make sure the thermometer is calibrated. There's a procedure for that, and the calibration tool, the standard you use, is traceable to a national standard. Then you'd want to check the records to make sure things were being done properly, and then you would actually want to watch the individual perform the job to make sure they're doing it correctly. All 3 of those are important. At least one should be done. They don't all have to be done. I want to make sure that's clear. So it's important to check the tools, the people, and the results and have proof that you're doing it correctly. Ineffective verification is where the answer you measure doesn't actually fit the question you should have asked. So, for example, if I'm asking, is the food being kept cold? I need proof of that. And the answer is, well, sure it is. Here are my cooler temperatures. That just doesn't work because it's not telling me enough information about product temperatures. And the same thing can happen in various programs, like conducting environmental monitoring when your concern is a specific pathogen, but instead you're testing for protein residue. It just doesn't work. Verification has to target the exact hazard. Validation is also a challenge. And the question is, how much science is enough science? And how often do I have to do this? And my first answer is, you have to do it every day. It's a matter of due diligence in the food industry that you need to remain aware of new hazards, what's going on with outbreaks, what's changing maybe with bacteria and their resistance to certain sanitizers or other mechanisms. It's very important to stay current. What I would call a young or maybe an immature food safety plan would rely on documents that we've all perhaps seen in the past, like the training material from the Preventive Controls for Human Food class. That's great stuff. Or the food code, or maybe some FDA or USDA documents online. Those are adequate, and they're going to be enough to get you started. As time goes by, though, you should always be working to collect more data from inside and outside the company. Published studies from journals and implant tests or evaluations, or just summaries of your data, which this is really important. When you collect data, you should watch that data for trends, because that's an important tool that you should be learning from. So those are kind of the key things that people should focus on to get started and to get the system rolling and to keep it going. A good place to start for what materials you need is that preventive controls training materials, the FDA guidance material, industry trade associations or universities, or sometimes it's good to get help from an outside person to review your plan with a fresh set of eyes to make sure you addressed what a responsible trained individual should address, because that's the standard that we're going to be held to.
Okay, great. Thank you, Cathy. You know, certainly record keeping and maintenance, near and dear to safety chain's heart, obviously with our system that helps our customers do that. What I find is interesting, and I'm glad you touched on it too, was from a maintenance standpoint, what we will often term as having the data intelligence, right, and the trending capabilities to for ongoing maintenance and improvement. So I think that's an important part. Thank you for mentioning that. Let me go ahead and take us to the next question, and Stephanie, I'll go ahead and circle back with you. How often should folks be reviewing and reassessing programs?
If you're a GFSI regulated facility, and that would be a SQF, a BRC, a AIB type of audit, then they require annual internal audits. So you should be going through your system at least once a year. If you are not one of those type of facilities and you're just trying to comply with FSMA regulations, it says in the legislation that you must review your food safety plan every 3 years and every time you have a major change. So if you're adding a new piece of equipment, let's say, that's going to be now controlling a hazard like an oven, a cooker, something along those lines, then definitely it's time to review your food safety plan. If you're going to begin buying a new high-risk ingredient from a new supplier, or they're opening up a new plant, it's time to look at your food safety plan. If you move, if you're adding on to your facility, if you're introducing a new allergen, those are all triggers to tell you it's time to review your food safety plan. And to review, to meet the legislation requirements, you have to document that review. So you need to list out who reviewed it, when you reviewed it, what did you look at, did you make any changes, what were the issues that triggered the review, was it due or was there some kind of process change, and go through that. That will be something that record keeping is going to be really important there, because you want to make sure you have a good way to identify that you actually reviewed your food safety plan and you made the right changes and updates if they were needed.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And what's interesting, right as I was asking this question, one of our folks from the audience asked a question around this. I'm going to go ahead and just extend this question to you because it extends a little bit beyond what you were just talking about. So we do have someone asking, is there a rule of thumb as to how often the scientific evidence in the HACCP plan should be reviewed and or updated?
I think you should definitely review and update it anytime there's been some kind of new industry news. So let's say you have a product that now has a recall, and it might not be from your facility, but that ingredient or that product is now associated with a pathogen that wasn't there before. It's time to look at your HACCP plan and make sure you're doing what you need to do to control that hazard in your facility. I recommend to my clients that they do this at least once a year, and then anytime there's something that would trigger them, like a major change or some new news, some new information about your food products that you produce.
Okay, great. I thought that was interesting. That question was very timely coming in concerning what you were just going through, so thank you for that. Let me go ahead and move us forward here. And Cathy, why don't you share as far as some of the top challenges or mistakes to avoid relative to supply chain control requirements that you've seen working with clients?
Sure. It's been repeated that this is one of the more difficult aspects of FSMA. The supply chain program is requiring a lot of effort from industry. So a lot of food safety teams dive right in and they leap toward writing a program and they forget what they wrote in the hazard analysis and why they have to write the program. The key to a successful supply chain program is basing it on risk, and that you collect the information you need based on the risks identified after you do that hazard analysis for ingredients that Stephanie talked about at our beginning. It's important to make sure that it is focused on the hazard analysis, and that's usually the first mistake people make. The next thing people assume is that a strong supply chain program means a great big mountain of paper, but they don't analyze the value of the paper, or they don't keep good control over that paper and what it really says and how to find it when you need it. It's a concern if a company uses surveys exclusively. A lot of companies use them. It's an important tool, but if you think about it, if you sent me a survey and I'm wanting to sell something to you and you ask me if I'm wonderful, of course I'm going to tell you I'm wonderful, I'm amazing. To strengthen those surveys, the next step is say, okay, glad to hear that, send me some evidence. And it's the person reviewing this material, it's their obligation to review that evidence, not just a survey. The next mistake or challenge that sometimes people have is that they rely too much on brokers or distributors. There are some very large companies out there that provide food to a lot of companies, and when you look at the details of FSMA and your requirement to understand your supplier, a broker or a distributor by definition is not a supplier. That's very important to understand. That's not to say you can't use brokers and distributors, but you need to work very closely with them to collect the information you need from the actual supplier pertaining to the actual hazards. Always go back to that hazard analysis. So it's not to say that brokers are bad, but brokers are going to have to be much more helpful as we move forward in implementing FSMA. And again, I have to emphasize, I mentioned this earlier, the mistake people make sometimes is just thinking that lots of data is the answer, and it's not the right data. They'll say, oh, let's get a certificate of analysis with every load, but they'll forget to identify what exactly should be on that certificate. It should be the specific hazard of concern, the test method that was used, the method detection limit, records created by second parties like the lab that you hire, or even the auditing company that you hire to help you with third-party audits. Those records need to be as good as your own, so they need to be well made. So it's important to keep an eye on that and make sure the information you collect is the right information. Another example would be where a company says, well, as part of our supply chain program, we're going to check labels when they come in the door, and labels have to be correct, but they don't say exactly what to look for on the label. And we all know labels are pretty complicated, and that's a daunting task. So the key thing to a successful supply chain program, in my opinion, is first carefully going through the hazard analysis, making that strong connection between specific hazards and specific ingredients, and then collecting the specific information you need to support the decisions you made. It's a lot of data collection and communication.
And analysis, right? Goes without saying. No, thank you for that. Well, a lot of information has been shared. Thank you, both Cathy and Stephanie. A lot of questions are coming in. But as we sort of wrap up the pre-submitted questions, Stephanie, why don't you go ahead and just sort of sum up? What are some key takeaways that you all have discussed today?
We addressed the new hazards, quote-unquote new hazards, that are now being required to be controlled under FSMA legislation. It's allergens, radiological, economic fraud as it affects food safety, and supply chain controls. Some of the common gaps that we addressed today were record keeping and a hazard analysis. The hazard analysis is really the cornerstone. This is really the foundation of your whole food safety plan. If it's poorly done and you're not controlling the right hazards and collecting the right data, then that's really where you're going to struggle. We went through the how-tos. I gave you a couple examples to go through, and it's really important to base this on your process risk. We talked about the common barriers of complying with this new legislation, and it's record keeping, verification and validation activities, really understanding what's required of those and how often you need to do them, and making sure you're collecting good data there. Your frequency of plan review, we said at least once every 3 years or after a major change. And then we also went through supply chain control challenges. And as Cathy went over, it's important to base this supplier, what you're requiring from your supplier, on the risk of that actual ingredient. So if they have a high-risk ingredient, then you would require more than someone who would have a low-risk ingredient that has less likelihood of having a hazard.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to go ahead and take us out of full screen. I really appreciate the audience participation. We have a good few questions that have already come in. If anyone else has questions they want to submit, you should see the Q&A tab now on the right-hand side, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the last 5-10 minutes that we have online today. So as those questions are coming in, I just wanted to take just a brief moment here. Cathy, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit more about HACCP Consulting Group for our audience, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. HCG has been around for 22 years now, and we are a group, I think, of 14 food safety professionals. We've got a really broad base of experience that includes USDA and FDA experience. We've got people who came from industry and quite a few people with prior regulatory experience within the USDA and the FDA. So we have a lot of perspective we can bring. We provide consulting and training to help increase food safety, but also facilitate trade, which means we help each other by consulting to build trust between people, and that's what enables trade. Trust really is what defines success, and we work with our partners to help them achieve the trust of their customers. We've worked in all 50 states, plus over 70 different countries. So if you think you could use some support or need that second set of eyes to review your food safety plan, we'd love to earn your trust and work for you too.
Great. Thank you, Cathy. I'll go ahead and just throw a question at you that has come in as you were talking. It looks like, well, I'll answer. I know HCG does a variety of trainings, but the one question that did come in was, is PCQI training mandatory?
That's an interesting question. The regulation says you have to have a preventive controls qualified individual to complete certain functions associated with the food safety plan, so we know that. What qualifies that person is that they've completed a curriculum that matches the approved one, or they can prove that they are competent through experience and job skills. Personally, I think that's going to be a little bit more challenging if you're concerned about your interaction with the FDA or with regulators. The simplest method is to demonstrate you've taken the course. In my opinion, it's not mandatory to take the course, but you do have to demonstrate that you've been through the curriculum, so you should at least get the course materials and study them.
Okay, great. Thank you. And let's go ahead and I'll touch on a few other things. We'll take some more questions as well. Just a little quick, brief intro to Safety Chain for those that aren't familiar with Safety Chain software. We do have a comprehensive management platform that enables both record keeping, but certainly more maintenance and data intelligence for trending and continuous improvement of your programs, whether it's specific areas such as supplier, your food safety or quality, or managing GFSI and FSMA requirements. And certainly there's some questions coming in about what we do, but I won't waste everyone's time online here, and we'll take some of those offline, but I just wanted to mention that. And before we finish up here, I want to get to a few more questions. I would also like to acknowledge and mention Food Safety Tech. They've done a great job in the industry in really providing ongoing continuous education and ways to be better informed, such as events like this, and they are having their annual conference coming up, Food Safety Consortium. Safety Chain will be there December 5th through 9th, so I encourage folks to take a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and stay on for those that are able to stay with us and address some of these questions. And Cathy and Stephanie, if I throw something at you that isn't quite, a little bit more detailed than we need to do here, we can always take some stuff offline. But let me go ahead and look at some of our questions. So one question that has come in is regards to going back to the matrix. And so, Stephanie, I'll go ahead and put this over to you. If the probability of an event increases with each incident, should the matrix be updated after every incident?
I would say most definitely. When we talk about reevaluating the food safety plan after a change, I would consider if you had an event, even if the probability originally you had thought it was remote, but now you see that it's potential, maybe it happened twice in a 6-month period, then it's time to reassess and go back to your hazard analysis and say, you know, I need to do more to control this hazard.
Okay, great, thank you. A couple more questions here, and one from Jeanette asking, as a broker, you know, we were talking about brokers today, do we have to provide our customers with names of our suppliers, or on questionnaires we give back, can we black out supplier's name and then send them to our customers? A little granular there, but I don't know if Cathy or Stephanie, if you want to address that.
I don't know that the law is going to give you that answer. The manufacturer who's asking for information from the broker needs details about food safety hazards and how they relate to the food they buy. If you're able to protect your source, because I know there's a desire to do that, you might be able to find a way, but you have to still communicate hazards and enable traceability, and that's the bottom line.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, and it's interesting here, you see the sort of vernacular out there quite a bit, that the concept of being FSMA certified, and I don't know if it's FSMA certified or you know, being able to prove that you're meeting FSMA requirements, but this question specifically is asking for outside validation. Is there a requirement of the lab to be FSMA certified? And again, Stephanie or Cathy, I'll let you, either one pipe in.
Okay. There really is not a term called FSMA certified, so that would be not the correct use of our vocabulary, I guess. But when looking at an outside lab, you should make sure they're accredited. It doesn't say that that's mandatory by law. Under third-party audit requirements, it's very often required that labs are certified to ISO 17025, but that's not a legal requirement under FSMA.
Okay. Great, thank you. You know, it's interesting. I see that a lot out there, FSMA certified, and I think there's just so much information out there as far as FSMA goes, so thank you for that clarification there. A couple other questions, and again, this one comes up quite a bit, and I'm sure it's on top of our mind, and you know, certainly Stephanie or Cathy, if you want to share your opinion on this, does it look like the FDA inspectors will be trained at the time we're required to have our programs in place, right? So we have one due here in a matter of days. You know, thoughts around that?
Well, what we're seeing as we're leading these classes around the country is there are many attendees that are actually employed by the FDA. So they are sending their folks through the same training that you would go to to become a PCQI, Preventive Controls Qualified Individual. So then after that training, at least the communication we're getting is that they're going to go through some regulator-specific training, but they've been in all of our classes that we lead, and they bring a different insight and a different perspective to the training, but they're going through the same training that it would qualify you as a preventive controls, a PCQI person.
That's one advantage of the live courses rather than studying on your own, is that interaction. And I really appreciate and value the fact that regulators and industry are learning together.
Right, and it's interesting because, again, the guidance documents just came out too, right? So there's still a lot of learning taking place. And I should mention that. And it looks like I'm going to go ahead and take just about one more question as we have to wrap up. But before we do that, I do want to mention again, HACCP Consulting Group provides a plethora of trainings. Absolutely encourage you to go to their website. I know certainly upcoming PCQI trainings. I don't know, Cathy, if there's any other trainings that you want to share as well that might be coming up.
If you go to our website under the events tab, we list all our public courses. If you don't see something you want, we also do a lot of private training.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and just wrap up with one last question here in regards to FSMA, and again, what's coming down the pike, if you will. So I know, Cathy, you mentioned that sanitary transportation, I believe, is in March. Is that the next thing that we'll be on the lookout for?
It is. That's the next due date for implementation, and it requires additional written procedures. Again, we need to communicate hazards clearly between transportation companies, carriers, receivers, to make sure that's done. And there's also a small training component for drivers.
That'll be part of that as well, the carrier. Okay, great, thank you. And again, we did have some other questions that came through. We do take these offline, and if we're able to, we'll certainly get back to you, but I encourage everyone, if they have further thoughts or questions that they might want to talk to HCG about, certainly look them up. And also do appreciate the opportunity here from Safety Chain's perspective of ongoing, trying to really learn and grow within the industry, and what is FSMA all about, and how to improve what's going on out there. So again, I really appreciate both Cathy and Stephanie, your insights and thoughts of all the years of experience really was appreciated today. And again, slides will be sent out. So again, thank you both Cathy and Stephanie for joining us today.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to be here.
Ma'am, I appreciate your time. Excellent. And Patty, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you with Food Safety Tech.
Well, great. That was a fascinating webinar. And Jill, Cathy, and Stephanie, thank you again for sharing all that valuable information with our attendees. And to our attendees, thank you for joining us, as well as for sending in a lot of great questions. As Jill mentioned, we will be following up with you after the event. And give us a day or two, and we will send out links to the archive recording of this event and a PDF of the slides, which we hope you will use for reference, as well as share with your colleagues. That concludes our event. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.